Welcome back, everyone. I thought I'd just give everyone an extra minute. Hopefully we're good to start. We're now moving into our keynote session, and I'm very pleased to introduce Graeme Keith. Graham's presentation is titled "All Models Wrong, Some Are Useful," which is drawing on the well-known observation by George Box. It's an interesting topic because, as many of you would know, that a model is meant to be useful and but not perfect replica of reality. So it's supposed to help us make better decisions. It can't really predict an outcome. Useful models should help us understand the problem, frame the uncertainty, explore the available choices, and take action with greater confidence. So that's what Graeme will be looking at in the next presentation, how things start with good modeling and the decision and the uncertainties. Um, so thank you, Graeme, for joining us today. And yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Oman. Emma, just give me a nod. Everyone can hear me okay. I assume people will start shouting at me if they can't hear me okay. So I assume everything's going great. Okay, good. And then I need to share here. And now, are you seeing the screen?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, great. Okay, yeah, my name is Graeme Keith. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing myself. You can look me up on LinkedIn and find out everything you want to know. Very welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. If you have any questions coming out of this presentation that you want to ask, then by all means, just write to me on LinkedIn. Always very happy to pick up conversations around this issue. That's it on me. We'll get diving straight in. A lot to get through, and I'd like to have some time at the end for questions. So I'll just dive straight in, and I'll talk a little bit to the title. This George Box quote used to wind me up a bit. It used to annoy me because it sort of gives the impression when it says all models are wrong, but some models are useful. It sort of gives the impression that that models are supposed to be right. And that it is somehow a sort of surprise or a disappointment that all models are wrong, and then a sort of lucky coincidence that some of them turned out to be useful. And I've always felt that the point of modeling was to be useful and to be used, and that being right was it was one of the criteria. How right it was, how accurate they were, how faithful they were, was one of the criteria of how useful they were. And I wrote about this on LinkedIn at one point, and a guy called Alex Lyashenko very kindly pointed out to me that actually the full Box quote is, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. So the question you need to ask is not, is the model true? It never is. But is the model good enough for this particular application? And that, to me, captures the essence of what it is that we're trying to do when we're modeling. And that's very much what this presentation is about. It's about trying to understand how we make our models good enough, and what good enough means. And all of this is going towards making sure that we have models that are useful and that are used. Okay, so just to kind of start us off, get us on the same page, I'm talking about risk modeling here. I understand risk as uncertainty. I'm not restricting it to specific events that have negative outcomes. It's not only downside risk. I'm just talking about uncertainties that influence objectives. It's a very broad definition, and I want to keep it broad on purpose. I take it as read that risk management has to influence decisions. If you're not actually moving the needle on anything, if you're not changing anything that you do, then there really isn't very much point in doing it at all. So I kind of think, there's a lot of discussion about, we need to be decision focused in our risk, or we need to be objective focused in our risk. And I'm kind of like, well, yeah, obviously, duh. We have to be trying to provide actionable information about decisions, and those decisions have to be related to some objectives. Otherwise, why are we here? What we do with risk modeling, I think, a very sort of way of sort of generalizing it very, very broadly, is to say what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand the relationship between the decisions we can make and the objectives we're trying to achieve. And we're trying to do that in a way where we can leverage data about the world. And I mean data in a very broad sense. Yes, numbers, yes, measurements, but also information about causal relationships, information that we can sort of extract from subject matter experts, people who understand the domains that we're working in. And that's what we're doing when we're modeling. We're trying to sort of connect these things, connect decisions, objectives, and data. When we do that, we have to do it in a way that is actionable, which means that the decisions have to be built into the model. I've seen an enormous number of actually fairly reasonable models, a lot of them describing the world in some way, but where the decisions aren't built into the model. And there's two problems with that. One is that you look at them and you think, okay, that's nice, and it's maybe a faithful representation of what we're looking at, but so what? What can we do with it? If we can't go in and intervene and change stuff in the model, then it's really not that much use to us. But the other thing, and I'll explain this in a minute, it's very important to have the decisions built into the model in order to get the level of complexity and the level of granularity in the model right. I'll come back to that in a second. Models have to be causal. Again, a lot of very good models, a lot of very faithful models, representative models, describe relationships. But unless you can go in and say, okay, I'm changing this thing here, and you can understand how that change, that choice, propagates through the causal pathway up to the objectives that we're interested in, then you can't really say anything about how decisions are going to change objectives. And you don't know whether you're dog or tail, and you don't know who's wagging who. So it's very important that the model is built to be causal. The model has to be stochastic because we're dealing with risk and we're dealing with uncertainties. Sometimes you get people trying to sort of ignore the uncertainty, build a model, and then sort of bring some wobble back into it later on, and that usually goes horribly wrong. So the model needs to be born stochastic. And then the final point here is that the model has to be simple but adequate. So you don't want the model to be more complicated than it has to be, but it has to be adequate to answer the questions that you're trying to ask of it. And generally what that means is that what we'll be doing is we'll be taking our decision, we'll be looking at the choices that are entailed by that decision, and we want to make sure that we can differentiate the outcomes in a reliable, robust way. That's all we need to be able to do. We need to be able to say which of those choices is the best choice for us. The model doesn't have to be better than that. As soon as we're feeling comfortable that we're able to do that, we're good, we're finished, and we can move on to the next problem. Most of the quantitative risk modeling that's done in the world is done within the context of very well-established modeling traditions. So we're talking about things like credit risk modeling, pretty much all financial risk, market prices, investment portfolios, options pricing, insurance, certainly, these sort of things. These are all sort of very well-established modeling traditions. You can go to university and you can study these things. You can do masters, PhDs in these things. You can have a whole research career in these fields, refining these models, improving them, trying to sort of get hold of some of the underlying assumptions and make them better, and so on and so on. I'm not talking about this here. I'm talking much more about the situations where we're maybe making decisions that are a bit more ad hoc, a bit more sort of one-off decisions, or they're decisions that aren't part of those established traditions. So maybe we're taking the decisions, on a regular basis, and maybe we're looking at investment options, but they're sort of messy, they're sort of real world, and they're not sort of subject to all of the good assumptions that go into those typically financial models in the established modeling traditions. A lot of people in this community are doing this kind of work. We're borrowing methodology from those established modeling traditions, and that's an absolutely fine thing to do. But we need to be a little bit careful, because in those established modeling traditions, it's very clear what it is that we're trying to do. It's very clear what the model is trying to reproduce. It's very clear what the decisions are. It's clear who's making them. It's clear what resources available are and things like that. And as soon as we come out of that, that's not often the case. And very often what we see is people sort of diving into the math without necessarily thinking very much about, okay, what is it we're trying to achieve here, and who is doing the problem solving, and so on and so forth. And that is incredibly important. It's incredibly important because it makes for much better models, and it makes sure that you get to the models, and you'll see this as I work through the presentation today. It makes sure that you get models that are fit for purpose and not sort of modeling under the noise floor or over engineering the solution. But it's also an absolutely essential step in making sure that the model is absorbed into the organization that you're working, that it becomes part of the decision processes, and that it survives the person who builds the model in the first place. I've seen a number of cases where either I've been helping people build models, and then they're very enthusiastic about it, and they build the model and they get everyone to use it and it works fine. But the second they leave, or the second they go and do something else in the organization, the second they sort of take their foot off the gas, it sort of fizzles out and no one uses it anymore. I've also come in after the fact and had people sort of who've built models, they've now left, and everyone's sitting there going, this was really good, but we don't really understand it or know how it works or anything like that. And again, it sort of fizzles out, and they're looking to resurrect it. So there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done upfront before we get into the mathematics. And this methodology that I'm showing here is really about trying to sort of contextualize the model, build it into decision processes. It has a lot to do with sort of trying to leave the mathematics as late as possible. I will argue, and I hope you will see in the course of this presentation, that the reason that we do that is because it makes for better models ultimately. But I think another reason to do that is that if you keep the mathematics sort of to the last step, then you're able to bring stakeholders a long way into the decision process, a long way into the modeling process. You're able to give them an understanding of what's going on, where the data are coming from, what it is that's included in the model, what's excluded from, all of these sorts of things, without necessarily disturbing them with any of the math. And very often, it's a little bit of a dice roll whether people like math or not. Some people sort of go running into the hills and they don't like it because, you know, they got stressed about it at school or something. And some people sort of love it, and it's, you know, but it's nice if you can kind of make sure that you get everyone around the table agreeing on the model, feeling some sense of ownership on the model, so that they like to use it and they want to use it and they understand what it's telling them. So in order to do that, we need to do a lot of work up front, and that work is trying to understand what is the decision we're supporting, who is making that decision, how often is this decision made, is it a one-off thing, or is it something that we do on a cadence? When we're building the model, who's going to build the model, what are their skill sets, what are the data we have available, how much resources do they have to generate new data, to find new data? That all applies to when we build the model, but it also applies to when we use the model. If we're doing this on a cadence, how long do we have to gather information? Who's doing that? What are their skill sets? How can they process that information? How much of this needs to be automated and taken offline? How much of them can be left in the hands of people doing those analyses? So there's a whole work around scoping, around framing, around understanding how it fits into decision processes. And then we get into the sort of building the model itself. And again, before we start even thinking about the sort of relationships between things in the model, we need to be thinking, what's the context here? Are there trends that we're trying to get hold of or that we're worried about? Are there opportunities that we can grab? Are there threats that we're concerned about? Obviously, we need to know what it is that we're trying to achieve, and we need to know what the levers are that we have in order to try and achieve those things. All the time we're sort of making these things, we want to be sort of capturing the fundamental assumptions that go into sort of building the model and contextualizing the model. And once we've done that, we get to the point of mapping. Now, most of this presentation is about mapping, and I'm going to talk about that as a sort of tool that we can use to achieve a lot of the things that I've been talking about trying to achieve. One thing I want to say before we sort of get into that is, this is not a sort of linear process. You don't sort of frame it and then you have the context and you know exactly what it is you're doing and who's doing what and so on, and then you do the mapping and then you go off and do the math. It's a much more fluid process. It's much more iterative. So you'll find that as you sort of develop the model and start understanding the interrelationship between things, you might be throwing up extra possible decisions or choices within that decision space that you're working with. You might have a more nuanced idea of what your objectives are. And so these things, and you might decide that actually it's too much work and it's not worth doing what it was you set out to do in the first place, or you might decide that actually it's so little work we can do more with it, or we can rescale it or whatever. So it's an iterative process. It's not a sort of, you know, strictly linear process. As I say, I'm going to talk a lot about the mapping, and then I'm going to sort of bleed a little bit into the mathematics. I'm also going to talk about how we use data to sort of contextualize these models, and that dialogue between the building of the model and the data that we have to condition it. And I'm going to do that through this very, very simple example. The simple example is me cycling to work. I don't cycle to work anymore. I work from home, as you can see. But I used to cycle to work, and I used to be late a little bit too often. And so the question I want to ask myself is, what time do I have to leave the house in order to get to work on time? Now that time is, you know, if someone did that every single day, if I just left myself an hour, then I would definitely manage that sort of 10 or 15 minute commute without any problem at all. But obviously, I really want to leave as late as I can, but I don't want to be late more than, say, once a week. So that's my kind of goal, is to not to be late for more than once a week. Now, very simple problem. I've chosen this problem on purpose, one, because I have a data set for it, and I'll show you that in a second, but also because I don't want to sort of complicate the storytelling that I'm doing here. So it's talking about the methods and the procedures and the mapping and all the rest of it by a complicated example. So I kept the example on purpose very, very simple. But it's a very nice example because it's analogous to a lot of business processes. I think a very obvious one is project schedule calculation. So looking at uncertainty on project schedules, project teams can be on better or worse form. One of the things that influences the time it takes me to cycle to work is how I'm feeling on the day. And you can think of sort of some project teams, you might have a lot of new members on them. Maybe they're not quite so efficient. You could also have an older team that is very well established and very good at doing these things. Projects encounter headwinds. You might be building a road and suddenly the bedrock isn't what you thought it was, and that just sort of slows everything down. And they also have tailwinds as well. Obviously, wind is going to be quite important in my cycle to work. And projects encounter delays. I mean, if you turn up a piece of crockery in a road build in Denmark, that means that your road construction site is going to be an archaeological dig for at least the next 6 months. And that's the kind of delay that you want to start thinking about and building into your project setting. So I don't want to labor this point too much. I just want to say, yes, it's a very simple, almost trivial example, but it's really about sort of demonstrating the methodology and how we use the methodology to sort of think through setting up a model. Okay. So let's get into the mapping piece. When we're doing mapping, when we're doing causal mapping, we're always starting with the decisions and the objectives. As I said earlier, they're not set in stone. We may want to change them later on, but to start with, we want to say, okay, what it is that we're trying to achieve, and what are the decision levers it has. So I said I want to arrive at a certain with a certain probability that I arrive late, and then the thing that I can change is the departure time. Excuse me. The decisions and objectives are the poles of the axis on which we build the model. By doing that, we make sure that the model is objective focused and it's actionable. We've got decision levers that can change things. It sets the scope and granularity of the model, and we'll talk about that more as we develop the model over the next few slides. And as I said before, it's not fixed. It can change in the course of the analysis. So what we're going to do is we're going to be working back from the objectives and working forward from the departure, and thinking about the causal relationships, the influences, the things that are affecting the objective, in this case arrival time, and the things that are influenced by the decision, in this case the departure time. And we're going to try and sort of join those two things up and try and understand the relationship between them. Before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about objectives and objective functions and things like that. When we talk about objectives, very often we mean targets. So you might say, a company might say, okay, we want to make X million dollars in revenue or profit in the coming year. That's not quite true. Really, what they want to do is they want to make much, much more money than that, but that's a number that they're prepared to commit to. So actually, very often when we're talking about objectives, what we really mean is what in optimization we would call an objective function. So that's the thing that we're measuring, that we're sort of checking our targets against. And that's the thing that's in the model, the objective function. So in this case, it's arrival time is the objective function. And really what we're trying to do is optimize that. Now, we also have a sort of separate conversation, which is what do we say to our shareholders? But very often when we're doing that optimization, we're also subject to some constraints. So we might say, okay, really, I've set this target to the shareholders, but really what I want to do is I want to maximize my profit. But I can't just sell everything and make a ton of money this year, because I need to have revenue growth and I need to make sure I'm getting return on my investment, and I want to have book value and things like that. So what you end up doing is you end up having something that you're trying to optimize, something you're trying to just maximize as much as possible. And then you have constraints. You have things that say, okay, I want to do this, but I want to make sure that I have a certain amount of reinvestment and I have a certain amount of return on my capital, and so on and so forth. Now, in the case of my cycling example here, my objective, in the sense of my objective function, which is not to arrive late more than once a week, that isn't actually an objective, it's a constraint. What I'm trying to do, the objective function, the thing that I'm trying to maximize is how late I can leave for work. I want to have as much time at home to sit out in the garden, read my paper and drink my coffee. So I want to leave as late as possible. Obviously, I can't leave myself 1 minute for that sort of 10 or 15 minute commute time, because then I'll just be late all the time. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to maximize the point that I can leave the house, subject to the constraint that on average, I don't want to be late more than once a week. Now, as I said, what we're going to do is we're going to work back from objectives and we're going to work forward from decisions, and we want to establish causal relationships. Now, what a causal relationship is a 40-minute presentation all on its own. But broadly speaking, if A is a cause of B, when everything else in the model is fixed, then changing the value of A will lead to a change in the value of B. Now, because we're working with stochastic functions here, it's really changing the value of A will change the probability of the value of B. But we're looking for that sort of mechanistic narrative between the things that we're identifying as influences in our model here. So we ask the question, what influences the objectives? And in this case, it's very simple. I leave at a certain time, it takes me a certain time to get to work, I arrive at a certain time. This is the simplest actionable causal model. The simplest causal model just has travel time. That's a travel time leading to arrival time. That's a causal model. But this is actionable because I've got my decision in there. And this is the simplest, this is the form of the simplest model in lots and lots and lots and lots of different applications. It's also the logo of my company here, which is why you might recognize this shape up here. You're seeing it in the bottom right-hand corner of the slides the whole time. It's actually a pretty good model and we can do a lot with it, and we're going to do that. But before I come back to it and start showing how you analyze it, I'm going to sort of unpack the model and do some more mapping before I get to doing the math. So what I then do is I sort of work back from some travel time. So I'm saying, okay, so what is influencing my travel time? Well, how fast I cycle, but also whether or not I'm delayed. So this is a little bit like my project headwinds and tailwinds, and this is the sort of the things that can go wrong that cause delays in the project. And I can just keep going with it. I can just keep working backwards. So my speed is dependent on how I'm feeling. Maybe I haven't slept very well. Maybe I had a little bit too much to drink the night before and I'm not feeling a little bit groggy in the morning. But I live in Denmark. It's flat. The wind blows a lot. So wind speed is actually quite important in this as well. And those are the factors that I'm taking into account that go into speed. Delays, largely two things. My bike breaks down a lot, get punctures. Shame I got ripped off on one of the trips that in my data set. And also, Denmark's a village. You're bumping into people the whole time. So on my way to work, I would bump into people and then I would stop and I would chat, and then that would inevitably lead to me being late. So that's something that I want to get hold of as well. Something that happens a lot as you go through this process and you start sort of tracking all the influences that are going up into the influences that are going up to influence your objective is that you start realizing there are places where you can intervene. So, for example, I could pump my tires up, I'd probably get fewer punctures. I could also decide myself, I could sort of establish a policy that says, okay, don't stop. If you see somebody, just give them a wave, say hi, and then, I don't know, send them an email after you get to work. I could also decide not to drink in the middle of the week. That would probably not be a bad thing. And I could also try and get to bed earlier. That's usually a little bit trickier. But this whole process where you're sort of identifying these nodes, you're sort of building out the model and starting to identify additional optionality in terms of the way that you can intervene and improve these things. One of the sort of interesting things here is that I can't do anything about the wind, obviously, but what I can do is I can look and see what the wind is doing, and I can set my departure time as a consequence of that. So it's that sort of thinking that you're having in the back of your mind as you're building through these models. Now, you can keep going with this. And the more you go, the more you'll sort of identify things, and in a sense, the richer the model. But one of the things I was warning against right at the beginning was over-engineering, modeling under the noise floor. Now, mapping is cheap. We can map, it doesn't take long. You're just sort of drawing pictures and, you know, maybe you're doing post-it notes, you're doing it in a workshop or whatever you're doing. Maybe you're doing it in the privacy of your own room. Mapping's fairly cheap. So there's never any harm in taking the map a step or two too far. And it's quite a useful thing to do, because what generally happens is you take the map a bit too far and then you'll go, oh, that's a bit too far. And then you'll roll it back into itself again. But when you've done that, you've realized what are the things that are missing. And so you've captured those assumptions. And you'll see this later on when I start working with this map. But this is really the most complicated that I wanted to take this map at this cost. Granularity is good in the sense that it throws up nodes, points at which you can intervene. So it gives you more options for controlling the risks, managing the risks, but it also, and more options should also give you better optimization, all other things being equal. The problem with granularity is it's very, very expensive. Every single time you sort of increase the level of granularity by sort of an order of one, you're increasing the amount of data that you need to successfully condition the model exponentially. And the reasons for that, which will become clear through the course of the presentation. You're also increasing the complexity of the model, and you're increasing the complexity of the execution. So granularity But you have to kind of get a feeling of when to stop, and that's partly driven by your decision space, and it's partly driven by your data, and we'll sort of see how that works as we move through the presentation. One of the things for this is why framing is so important. This is why it's so important to understand who's going to do this analysis, what are their skill sets, what time do they have, what resources do they have. And that's also going to sort of play into where we sort of stop with the expansion of the model and where we sort of lock it down and say, okay, now we're going to sort of start working with this, and this is what we're optimizing over. But as I say, not a bad idea to sort of get a little bit carried away with the mapping and then roll it back to an earlier iteration later on. Okay, this is my data set. I basically mostly got this after the fact. So I just went into I have a sort of training watch, and I was timing myself backwards and forwards to work, so I could see how long it was taking me. I could see how long I was stopping for. So all I really needed to do was to make notes about, did I stop and how I was feeling and things like that. But I have about 8 weeks of data here, all from the same sort of time of the year. That'll become important later on. Not contiguous at all. I certainly wasn't cycling to work every single day. And then the thing that I did with the wind is I just went into the Danish Meteorological Institute and downloaded their wind data. So I got which direction the wind was coming from. That's in, what do they call it? Octant. So sort of north, northwest, west, so on. And then wind speed. Now, obviously, the wind speed is 10 meters high at some mast somewhere kind of vaguely close to where I was cycling, but it's not the wind that's actually in my face when I'm cycling. So it's indicative information, but it's not sort of direct causally impacting information. So we'll come back to that later on. But this is my data set. So we'll go back to our simplest model. This was the simplest model. And my objective is to leave as late as possible. And my constraint is that I don't want to be late more than once a week. Now, I don't want to get into the math of this. If you understand the math of this, then you will get this instantly. And if you don't, then it'll take me too long to unpack it. The slides are available. If the slides aren't downloadable, you can just contact me on LinkedIn and I'll send them to you. And I'll walk through the logic of these things. But basically what I want to do is I want to leave at the 80th percentile of my travel time. So if I understand my uncertainty on travel time, if I leave on the 80th percentile, so that's the number where 80% of the time I'm faster than that time. If I leave then obviously I'll be faster than that time 80% of the time, which means that I'll be late 20% of the time or less. So I want to be on that 80th percentile there. So if I knew the uncertainty, and this is so if I was given this curve, somehow somebody sort of waved a magic wand and said, oh, look, this is your uncertainty. What this is showing is probability in vertical direction here and travel time horizontally here. And what it says is, so for example, if I go here, what it says is that the probability of being 15 minutes or faster is 60%. Obviously, I'm looking at the wrong thing. I should have been doing it over here. So you can see can you see the cursor? No, never mind. If you go up from 15, crosses the line, go across, it says 60%. And so obviously what I want is the 80th percentile. So I go to the 80% line, come over, and it hits the curve at around 23 minutes or something like that. So my 80th percentile is about 23 minutes. So if I had the uncertainty, then I could just read off what the 80th percentile was, and that would be that. So the question then is, how do I get that uncertainty? Now, what a lot of people do when they're presented with data set like this one, is they'll start drawing histograms. I hate histograms. I don't think you should ever draw a histogram. What you should do instead is this. This is an empirical distribution function. What you do is you take the times that are in that data and you put them in order. And then what you do is you plot essentially their rank, where they come in that order, against the times themselves. But you scale this in a very simple way. And then that ensures that this gets as close to the cumulative distribution function as possible. It's a very, very neat trick, very, very powerful, very easy to do, and actually very insightful in terms of what the data are telling you. So that's what I did here, and I plotted the data. So you'll see it's just going continuously up from there because they're in order. And I'm seeing that I'm getting a lot of times coming in between sort of 10 and 15 minutes. And then I have this sort of long tail sliding out to the side here. And then what I did simply was just fit that curve through those data points there. And that's how I got my uncertainty distribution. So I can do one or two things just to get that 80th percentile. I can read it off the curve. That gets me around 23 minutes. I can also take the 80th percentile of those data. And what that means is that if I take the data point where 80% of the data are faster and 20% are slower, I know if I had left at that time over the course of those 8 weeks, then I would have been on time 80% of the time and I would have been late 20% of the time. both cases gives me a travel time of about 23 minutes. And in a sense, that's it. I mean, I've answered my question. How early do I have to leave? I have to leave 23 minutes before I'm supposed to get there, then I'll be fine. But I know that actually, if you look here, most of these times are coming in sort of 10, 15 minutes. Now, this is a cumulative distribution function. I can differentiate that and I can see what the probability density function is. I can get a sort of better visual of where the times, how the times are sort of distributed. And what I'm seeing is actually most of the time I'm coming in between sort of 10 and 15 minutes or 12 and 14 minutes, something like that. So it seems in a sense a little bit conservative to leave myself 23 minutes. I kind of get the feeling I can do a little bit better than that. And that's really what we're trying to achieve by building this model and looking at the other interventions. Okay, this was the most complicated mapping that I got through so far. I've got in here, I've got row conditions. So what I had from before, I had the speed, I had how I was feeling, I had the wind, and I had these meetings. I also have traffic lights coming in here. I don't have any data on traffic lights, so there's not a lot I can do with that. That's really just kind of absorbed and treated as noise. But I had these things, and then I thought, oh, actually, if the road's a bit icy, that might slow me down. So that was row conditions. And then I thought, oh, well, I have row conditions. That's dependent on the season. And then I realized that actually season was interesting because season actually depends on the wind. It's generally windier in the winter than it is in the summer. But I only have data for spring. I only have data over these sort of 8 weeks in the sort of early, late spring of whenever it was, many years ago now. So it's not, I can't really do anything with this. And I'm getting the feeling here, it's not really introducing any new interventions. So I'm going to take it out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to note this as assumption. I'm assuming that the seasonal effects are mostly manifested through the wind speed. And I'm saying that row conditions don't make a huge amount of difference. That may or may not be true, but that's there as an assumption, and we can keep that in mind as we're using this model. So this knocks me back to this model. This is the model that I'm going to use. And what I want to do is I want to change the values of these. I want to investigate these interventions. So I want to understand how maintenance propagates through the causal chain up through to arrival time, how stopping policy does the same. I want to understand how this works. I want to understand the relationship between the wind speed and my cycling speed, so I can see what this would look like and how I get that to work. And I want to see, would it matter if I stop drinking in the middle of the week or if I try to get myself to bed on time? In order to do that, I need to sort of track those relationships. And there's really two ways of doing this. One is what we call conditioning. And in conditioning, what you do is you try to keep as much as possible of the model as stationary as possible, the same values. So you pick values in your data set where everything else is fixed. And then you look at the remaining variation on the value that you're interested in, you see how it affects the output. That is why whenever you increase the size of the model, you massively increase the amount of data that you need to be able to condition the model. And it's generally quite difficult and it's a hard thing to do. We will do it, and you'll see that for form in a few slides' time, but it's hard. If you can, it's very nice to be able to break the causal link. And I can do that here because I've recorded my delays. So what I can do is I can effectively remove delays from the model by just subtracting the delays out of my data set. And then what I have is a data set for a world without delays. If I do that, my model looks like this. And then I can start sort of zeroing in on that side of the model. And then later on, I'll bring the delays back. Okay. So if I do this, I'm now looking at what I'm going to call a moving time. So that's a time where I've removed the delays. It's not strictly moving because I might have stopped for traffic lights, or I might have stopped because the wind was just too terrible, or whatever. But I'm going to call it moving time. So it's time without delays. And I'm actually not going to look at moving time. I'm going to look at moving speed. So I'm going to distance divided by the time because I want to be able to control it, compare it to wind speed, and it makes more sense to compare speeds with speeds. So this is my moving speed, and I've done the same trick. I've made my empirical distribution function, and I can see what this looks like here. And I can put this into my model. I can just say that, okay, this is my model for speed here. And I can sort of roll up wind and form into speed and just look at the uncertainty on speed independent of the things that are influencing it. And that's what I would do here. I'd look at that distribution and I'd say, okay, what is that distribution? Is it a normal distribution? Does it have some other kind of distribution? There's absolutely no reason at all to suppose it is normal, but it's relatively easy to check. One of the things that I can do is I can sort of stretch the axis, the horizontal axis, in a very particular way, so that if these data were normally distributed, they would fall on a straight line. They wouldn't fall on an exact straight line, because there's noise in the data, obviously, but I know what the uncertainty is. I know what the wobble should be. and I can plot that. This is one standard deviation away, which is actually quite a tight constraint. So it's like a 60% confidence interval. And what I'm seeing is that these data are actually falling quite close to the line there. Now, does that mean this is normal? No, not really. It's very clearly not normal. It's got thick tails under all circumstances. And I think its deviation from normal is so consistent that it's actually pointing towards some other kind of distribution. But in a sense, it doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is because this is about as good as it gets as a fit. And if I took a different distribution, if I scaled this in a different way and got a different straight line, I would not get better than this in terms of the fit. So no, it's not normal. Normal is probably not a terribly good distribution to use. If I had a lot more data, I'd probably be looking for something a little bit more sophisticated. But for these purposes, for the data I have, for the problem that I'm trying to solve, normal is as good as it gets. So I may as well use normal, which is nice because that saves me some simulation and I can do some math instead of just crunching everything through the Monte Carlo. Okay. Moving speed is a function of wind, form, and noise, including the light. Now we have to separate these things out. The first thing I'm going to do is try and look at the relationship between the wind speed resolved in the direction of travel and my moving speed, and that's relatively straightforward. I can just plot how fast I'm moving, that's vertically, against the wind speed. And wind speed goes from about -10 to 10 meters per second. As I say, this is at some mast somewhere 10 meters above the ground. It's not actually what I'm experiencing. But what I've done is I've taken the direction of the wind and I've resolved it into the average direction of travel. And that's -10 to 10. And I can see what my cycling speed is as a consequence of that. We can see very clearly, and unsurprisingly, there's a relationship here. We could do a whole bunch of physical modeling to try and make a good, get a good sense of what that physical relationship would look like, but that really would be modeling under the noise floor. I confess, I have done this before. I've spent time working on that physical model, but with all the uncertainty about where the measurements are taken and what I'm experiencing, and you end up with sort of quite complicated models that you just don't have enough data to parameterize. So the simplest thing to do here is just plot a straight line through that. So what we're doing is we're saying that the moving speed is just a straight line function of the resolved wind speed, and it has this noise term. And the noise term really is containing absolutely everything that isn't wind at this point. So it's containing form, it's containing light, it's containing absolutely everything. And what I do is I fit the line. I choose these numbers. I choose the line to minimize the variance, to minimize the amount of noise in that term. This is just linear regression. Very straightforward, very simple. Then what I do is, because I've got the moving speed as a function of wind speed, what I can do is I can adjust moving speed to 0 wind speed. So I have a sort of wind adjusted moving speed. And what I've tried to do there, so I've got the moving speed, which includes the effect of winds. And what I've tried to do is essentially remove the effect of wind. And what that should do is it should reduce the uncertainty, which it does. I can look at that and I can see, is it normal? And it's a little bit the same story as before. I'm obviously hitting some sort of saturation here, which is that a tailwind won't make you infinitely fast. At some point, you start running up against other factors like rolling resistance, and then I've got the fat tail down here. But again, I could use a normal distribution here if I wanted to, and I'm not gonna get better using a different distribution there. And that would be information enough if I just had the resolved wind and then speed and then the moving time, but I want to have power in here. Now, it's tempting to say power is wrapped up into this noise parameter here, and so I can just extract it out of that. But actually, it's a much better thing to do just to repeat this analysis for the different kinds of the different conditions I'm in. So this is what I was talking about when I was saying conditioning. What we do is we look at all the times when I was underslept, all the times when I was hungover, and all the times when I was fresh, and we do this and we repeat that analysis for all 3 of them. And it looks like this. So what I've done is I've taken all of this is still travel speed, this is still wind speed, and I've colored them according to what state of what physical state I was in the morning those days. And you can see that being underslept clearly slows me down. The effect is bigger when I have a headwind than a tailwind. See that instantly. I don't really trust this hungover data because I don't really have enough data points for it. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. This is this is all journeys here. This is the same that I had before. No, it's not. Sorry, this is fresh. This is when I'm fresh. And so we're essentially just repeating that analysis again. So now I have this very, very simple model. I have this for every single form. I have a straight line fit to wind speed, and I have a noise term. And these are the noise terms. Don't have a huge amount of data for underslept, so the uncertainty is fairly big. It's a little bit better for when I'm fresh. And I'm actually seeing some interesting forms here. Again, it's clearly not normal, but I'm not going to do better with any other distribution, so I'm going to use normal. Don't really trust the hungover curve. So this is my model. And what I can do, and I won't go through this, as I say, you can have the slides, you can go through this yourself. What I need to do is I need to calculate, on the basis of this model, I need to calculate my P20 moving speed, because that will correspond to my P80 moving time. So the 20th percentile of speed corresponds to the 80th percentile of time. And I can do that, and I don't have to do any Monte Carlo at all. I can do this all analytically. And this is how you do that. And when I do that, what I can do is I can plot the P80, the 80th percentile of time, as a function of moving speed for all of my different forms. And now I'm actually an awfully long way to answering all the questions I need to answer about my trip to work. I can see the difference form makes. I can see the difference form makes very clearly. I can also see that form makes a hell of a bigger difference when the wind is against me than when the wind is with me. I can see what the effect of wind is. I can see that there's about 5 minutes between having a strong tailwind and a strong headwind. And actually, I could use this to decide when it was I wanted to go to work. And at the face of it, you kind of think, this is pretty good. I was talking about 23 minutes before, but now I'm talking about now I'm into that 12 to 14 minute range, and I can just make adjustments for form and wind, and I'm doing an awful lot better. But we left delays out, and delays are obviously very important. So we're going to talk a little bit about delays. Okay, I have two kinds of delays. I've got mechanical failures, things breaking down, and these chance meetings. And I've got 4 meetings in my data set. The mean delay for a meeting was 14 minutes, standard deviation 4.3 minutes, 5 failures, mean delay 14 minutes, standard deviation much broader. Now, generally speaking, if you don't have a lot of data, and these are not a lot of data, if you don't have a lot of data, you should try and keep the distributions as simple as possible, either 1 parameter or 2 parameter distributions. You're really kidding yourself. If you're using something like a PERT or even triangle or something like that, where you've got a lot of different parameters, you don't really have enough data to lock those down. You should be trying to keep things as simple as possible. When I first kind of started modeling this problem, I was thinking maybe using exponential for these delays because I had so few data, literally 4 meetings and 5 failures. But I didn't want to do that because I have this issue around the standard deviation. There's a big difference. And the feeling I get is that maybe the failure distribution kind of makes sense with my understanding of the mechanisms. The failure distribution has a large skew and a long tail. So I want to try and capture that somehow. So I wasn't keen about using exponential. Didn't really want to use normal because with that large deviation, I'm going to end up with negative delays, and that's just crazy and mind-blowing. And it's not really going to fit the data very well. And now what I'm doing is I'm bringing some sort of subject matter expertise to bear. I know that this kind of mechanism, the kind of thing where you're sitting there and you're having a chat, and as time goes on, you're thinking, I really need to be getting out of here. And so the probability that you stop gets lower and lower, gets higher and higher as you go on in time. That corresponds to something called the Weibull distribution. It's used a lot in failure reliability analyses, and it's a fitting thing to use here. It's positive all the time. It has the right amount of skew. It captures this difference between the standard deviations, and it's a very nice distribution to use for my delay. So that's what I do. I just fit it to the mean and standard deviation. The red curve here is my meetings. The blue curve here is my failures. You can see the distribution on the meetings is a lot lower than the distribution on the failures, largely because I have a bit more control over the meetings than the failures, which is something that's a little bit more out of my control. And also I've done the same trick with the empirical distribution function and then fitting the fitted curve so you can see how well it fits the data, and that's pretty solid. So now I'm done. I've got my whole model. I've got the overall travel time is the distance divided by the moving speed, and I've got my model for that involving the wind and form, and then I've got coming from meetings and coming from failures. Now I have to do Monte Carlo. Even if I'd used normal distributions for these, I still would have to do Monte Carlo because I don't have enough risks to use the analytical methods to add them up. And there's no easy way of adding 2 Weibull distributions and an inverse normal distribution together. So I'm using Monte Carlo to do this. If anyone's interested, this is done in Model Risk, and I'm very happy to share the spreadsheet. Just write to me on LinkedIn, and I can send you the spreadsheet. You can see how all of this works, including the data analytic. Should have mentioned the delays, obviously I don't have a delay every single time I cycle, so I'm using a Poisson distribution to say how many delays there are, because there could in principle be more. I could in principle meet more than one person, and my bike could in principle fail more than once in the course of a trip. So I'm just using the Poisson distribution, and I'm using the average rate of occurrence over the 40 data points that I have. Now, simulating this using model risk, I want to look at a range of wind speeds, and I want to look at all the different forms. I have 21 wind speeds, which is basically -10 to 10 at 1 meter per second intervals. And I have the 3 different forms. So that's 63 cases. So it could get quite heavy. No, I'm not massively heavy. It wouldn't be very problematic under any circumstances, but it could get a little bit tedious, kind of having to go off and make a cup of coffee while it's doing the run, kind of tedious. But actually, I'm not interested in the interrelationship between these two things. So I can actually sample just 5 different variables, and then I can apply those variables to each of those 63 cases. So I can actually do the Monte Carlo simulation in kind of parallel across those 63 cases. And then when I do that, this is the sort of thing that I get. And now I'm including delays. And what I'm seeing is that where there's no wind, depending on my form, I'm looking at maybe sort of 14, 15, 16 minutes, unless I'm very, very underslept, and then it's closer to 20. So huge improvement on 23 there. I've got any kind of tailwind, then that's speeding me up as well. And then I can be taking these things into account when I'm thinking about leaving. I can change my I can fix my bike. I can pump up my tires and try and reduce the number of punctures I have. If I do that, I'll get fewer punctures, and I can just say, okay, that reduces the rate of failure. It actually changes the distribution too, and the reason it changes the distribution is because it's removing the punctures, but it's not removing the things that take longer. So really what I ought to be doing is looking at that more closely and changing the distribution, looking more closely at how maintenance would influence the parameters that are governing that uncertainty distribution. I didn't do that. I just wanted to get a order of magnitude sense of how much maintenance changes things. So what I did is, instead of looking at the individual forms, I look at this, which is all of the forms together. So I'm just looking at all journeys in Noring form, and I can see it saves me a couple of minutes. So regularly pumping my tires up would save me a couple of, would allow me to leave for work a couple of minutes later. And then I can ask myself the question, is that worth it? Is it worth doing that extra work to save those couple of punctures? Probably is. If I make a policy not to stop and just to wave at my friends and cycle on past them, anyone who knows me knows that I'm never going to do that, but we can play with the idea. Then that's actually a more significant saving. But as I say, I'm not going to do that. So, and I can look at looking at the effect of both things together. Okay, this has been a bit of a speed date. I've been charging through this very quickly because I wanted to get all of the stuff around data analytics, all around the modeling, how we use the model and all the rest of it. And I wanted to do it and leave a lot of time for questions. I think I've managed to do that. I've just got a couple more slides, little slide with a takeaway, and then there's a little epilogue, which is kind of fine for nerdy people like me. Okay, so the takeaways: causal mapping provides a model that aligns decisions and objectives in a way that makes optimal use of available data. It's actionable, it's built to be, it's causal, it's constructed that way, it's stochastic, it's constructed that way. And what I've tried to explain is how you can sort of manage that dialogue between the data that are available, the sophistication, the granularity of the model that you're using, in the context of that broader framing that you've done around the model, in order to sort of get the level right and make the model as simple as it can be, but not simple. Causal mapping is an excellent tool to co-create models with decision makers. Now, decision makers are not going to be particularly, well, it depends on their background, but they're generally not very happy about this sort of thing, and certainly not about this sort of thing, and even less about, this sort of thing. But they're usually pretty happy with something like this, because it gives them a very strong sense of, okay, I know what is being taken into account when this thing is spitting numbers out at me. Not only do I know what variables are being taken into account, I know where the data are coming from to give information around those variables. So you can actually get a very deep sense of ownership, a very deep sense of understanding around what is being done when somebody is coming at you and showing you these figures and showing you what's going on. Without necessarily at all getting into any of the details of which distribution you're using and what the relationships are and whether you're using Monte Carlo or other methods and so on and so on. So in that sense, mapping is a very, very powerful tool for stakeholder management. Causal map's powerful for data analytics and model building. I hope I've demonstrated that. A lot of what we were doing today was actually more in the case of over in the sort of side of using the data to make decisions as much as using the model to make decisions. And again, I think these two things need to talk to each other. And causal maps are inherently scalable. This is a very parochial, very local risk that I'm looking at here. Very, 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 very simple. But I've done this kind of mapping for entire enterprises where you start looking at profit, and then you're looking at revenue and costs, and then you're splitting revenue out into sales and price, and then you're looking prices going into the sort of global macroeconomic and market influences, and costs is going out into all of the different things that are influencing costs. And you can build relatively sophisticated, but nevertheless very powerful, insightful models for enterprises. I've done this at a sort of national level, looking at influences under the COVID crisis. So it's very possible to take this methodology, and it's pretty much exactly the same methodology. You can do it at a very, very, very local level, and you can also do it at a very large macro level. One more thing before I stop for questions, because I kind of have time and it's kind of a fun thing to do. If you remember this plot here, the red line there is a sort of normal, it's assuming this is the uncertainty that's left when we've taken account of wind and the wind fluctuation. So we've corrected for the wind. So it's a zero wind average moving speed. So we've taken delays out, we've taken wind out, and we're looking only at one form. So all of the other influences that give us variability to our moving time and to our overall time, I've removed everything that I could possibly remove. And this is the sort of underlying uncertainty that's left. It's everything that's left when I've removed everything that I can remove. And when I look at this, it has this funny shape. It sort of tips up here, and then it flattens out a bit, and then it tips up here. As I say, this is a cumulative distribution function. So this is this thing where, if you imagine something drawn through this, that line is telling you the probability of getting this speed or less. And if you know about probability, you know that the slope of that curve gives you the is the probability distribution function. So it shows you how the moving times are sort of distributed. And when you see this, it looks like it has a double peak shape. It looks like there's a sort of peak here, sort of things accumulating around 9 minutes, and a peak, 9 meters per second, and a peak here with things accumulating around 10.5 meters per second. And I kind of looked at that and I thought, that's kind of interesting. Where is that coming from? And did the analysis, and so this is my fit to the empirical distribution function, and this is the double peak that you're seeing in the data there, and realized that the distance between these two things is exactly 1.5 minutes, which is exactly the mean waiting time of a traffic light in North Copenhagen. What's happening here is there are 3 traffic lights on my trip to work. The probability of me getting none of them is very small. The probability of me hitting all 3 of them, having to wait at all 3 of them, is also very small. The probability of hitting 1 or 2 is pretty much equal and reasonably large. And so what you're seeing here is a mixture distribution. And what's happening is these times are accumulating around 9 meters per second here, which is the time where I only have to stop at one light. And these ones here are accumulating around 10.5 meters per second, which is the speed corresponding to the time where I have to stop at 2 out of the 3 lights. So it's quite a nice little feature there that you're able to sort of extract from the data, and it's quite a nice note to end on. So I will park it there, and we will have 10 or 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Graeme. Yeah, this was outstanding. I have a few of myself, but we have one from one attendee that says, if you try to build the model with a Bayesian network.
It's a really interesting question. That I mean, I would say this was a Bayesian network. I mean, in the Bayesian net, I mean, it depends what you mean by a Bayesian network, but in the sense that you have uncertainty variables that are impacting on each other in the way that you have in, for example, Fenton and Niels books on Bayesian networks. That's exactly what this is. So I'm not really sure what the answer to that is. I think there's enough ambiguity about the definition of a Bayesian network that I could, hand on heart say that this is a Bayesian network, and that's pretty much what I've been doing here. I mean, if you're starting with bringing Bayesian theory in, then what we're doing there is we're doing the sort of thing that you would be doing, which would be the next presentation. If I were to, talk for another 3/4 of an hour, what I would be talking about would be the uncertainty on the parameters that are describing my uncertainty distributions. And that puts us very squarely into that sort of Bayesian theory. But I think what I'm doing here is close enough to what a lot of people call Bayesian networks that I think the answer to that question is this is a Bayesian network.
Thank you, Graeme. That's one question. I had one myself. So as the attendees, generate another one is that you remember. Well, you presented this empirical distribution when you set up with the samples. So is there? Do you have any type of, I don't know, material that you can share or something? Because I think that for us practitioners, this is a roadblock that we always hit. And you see that the circumventing that is I mean, that would be great, because otherwise it takes a lot of time to get enough points and things like that. So I think that would be, if you can share something, or if you can refer to some material on that, if you did it, or please go ahead.
So my reference for that is this.
Excellent, thank you.
And it's right at the beginning, and it talks about empirical distribution functions and why it works, and goes through the derivation of the formula that I show you in the slides there. Empirical distribution functions is one of these things. It's incredibly simple. I mean, all you're doing is putting your data in order, and then you're plotting rank over 1 plus the number of data points against the data. That's it. And then that corresponds to an empirical distribution function. That's an absolute doddle, and it's very, very, very easy thing to do. And I think it's a much more powerful thing to do than drawing a histogram, because histograms are really hard, because you've got all sorts of choices about the number of bins and whether they should be uniform and all of these things, and they always end up looking a bit of a mess. Even when you're doing Monte Carlo with like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of points, you've still got this random bar that like pops up in the middle and messes up the nice shapes of the distributions and stuff. So I don't like histograms. Empirical distribution, that is very simple. You're just putting them in order, scaling, and plotting them against each other. What gets a little bit complicated is why that works, and that's actually very subtle, and that's in the book here. And then the other thing that I've done here, and I've kind of been a little bit cheaty about it, is that I've fit these polynomials to the EDF curves, and then because they're polynomials, I can differentiate them. If you look at the spreadsheet, it's all in there. You can see how it works. You can just copy the methodology across.
Thank you so much. And the second one that I have is the one that, of course, this was, as you well said, a local, and I would say, and we were making fun with that man, because this is not as trivial. I mean, maybe for you it's trivial, but for us it's not as trivial. So the question was, when you do this for a company, or as you mentioned, you have the profit, the cost, the revenue, etc. You approach it with a different methodology, because or you have like different Bayesian or different causal or Bayesian networks that are going to be one together. How do you do it?
The methodology is exactly the same. It's exactly the same. So, you know, and the steps that I go through in this presentation are exactly the steps that I will do with a company for those sort of things. So, for example, I had a mining company recently, and we were talking about electrification of their fleets. And then what you're doing there is you're starting off with the objectives there are really just NPV, right? And then you're sort of just working back through and working through the influences. You start with the objective, you start with the decisions. You go through, it's really all about cost, so you're splitting those out into all of the different pieces. You're finding the things that are influencing those things. The methodology is exactly the same. The whole thing where you're sort of going back and you're making it more and more granular, you're finding more places where you can do stuff, but at the same time the model's getting more complicated, and then you're sort of bringing it back in. That is very much, I mean, this is the reason I use this as an example, is because the steps in the methodology are exactly the same, whether you're doing this for a cycling to work example, or whether you're doing this for sort of, you know, enterprise risks or you know, serious kind of investment decisions or whatever it is. A couple of things I'd also mention. One of the nice things about this is that it throws up metrics, KRIs, or whatever you want to call them. So in this example, the wind is actually, you know, we're using the wind to make a decision about when to go, but that's actually a really powerful indicator. It's telling you how long you know, it's actually showing you how, you know, how there's something that you can measure that is telling you a lot of information about how your distribution changes. And that's something that you get a lot in practical applications as well. When you work through the map, you start identifying KPIs, KRIs, whatever they are, and not only do they tell you how, you know, how your risk is evolving, they also tell you what the relationship is. And a really good example of this is, you know, I've done this sort of work in safety context in oil and gas, And people are very excited about lost time injuries, and they're very excited about the amount of time that it takes to the amount of time people are losing, and they use that as an indicator for more serious accidents. And that's true, and you can see that in the causal map that has that relationship. But the other thing you realize, of course, is that lost time incidents have an awful lot to do with reporting culture, and there are different ways of influencing the lost time incidents. So what you end up with is the realization that the number has a relationship to the objective, but it's not a direct relationship. And it's not always the case that controlling the number, the KPI, leads to the outcome that you're desiring and looking for in the outcome that you're looking for.
Excellent. Thank you, Graeme. We have two ones. Well, one, it says and I think that it's for everybody. We will be very much interested in the Excel and the presentation, so I think that you will send it to us and we will share with you guys. And the second one,
send the presentation, the slides. You can have the Excel. I'd ask people to get in touch with me directly, and then I'll share the Excel with people there.
Excellent. I was going to ask if I can put your LinkedIn profile link there. Okay, I will do that in the post. During the post, I will do that. And we had another question from Jorgen. He says, have you done this risk modeling for a public sector organization, and which are the biggest differences between private and public sector in your experience? And he's also in Scandinavia.
Short answer is yes. A lot of people ask me this, and they ask me, actually, no, this is a new question, but what a lot of people ask me is what sectors are particularly well suited to this or have a particular appetite for doing this? And I have no answer to that. My clients come from all sorts of different sectors, and they come from all sorts of different industries. And the difference between two clients within that are the same size in the same industry is as big as the difference between two clients from completely different industries and completely different sizes. It really has a lot to do with, there's so many things that sort of play into the best way to manage introducing these kind of methodologies into companies. So a lot of what I do as an advisor is I go to companies and I look at what they do in risk, and I try and sort of identify what they do well and try and find ways of bringing quantification to bear that can make it better. And I try and find places where they maybe have a lot of data, or they have a lot of sort of very good workflow that is capable of generating data, and then to say, okay, how can we use that to bring in these methods and make things different? But it's different every single time, and the politics are different, the stakeholder management is different, the models are different, everything is different. It's very difficult to sort of make generalizations. I know that's a very unsatisfactory answer, but that's the truth of the matter.
Thank you so much, Graeme. Yeah, I just added your LinkedIn link in the chat below. If people are interested in the Excel model, so they can contact you directly. And I don't think that we have more questions. I don't know if you have like a last closing minute sentence, and I will pass it to Aman.
Oh, sorry, Aman was going to closing sentence?
Oh no, it's for you. Just if you have anything else, I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
No, I've been banging on constantly for the last hour. I think people have had more than enough of me. I think we should pass it back to Aman and close me out for the day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Graeme. That was a really interesting session. And a useful reminder that the best models are not the most complicated ones, but the ones that help us make better decisions. I really enjoyed the commuting example. I may reach out to you next time I'm planning a customer meeting in Delhi or Mumbai, so working out what time to leave in one of those cities is an exercise in itself. Yeah. But thank you again. So we're now going to take a short break. Let's return 4:05 p.m. UK time this time. And the next speaker we have for you is the very special one again, Gus. So see you at 4:05 p.m.